Hello and welcome to Startup Hack. Today we are going to discuss about C# null handling techniques for better code, maximizing code robustness and avoiding null reference exceptions. So let's get started. So today's agenda is number 1, null reference exception, number 2, null coalescing operator, number 3, null conditional operator, number 4, non-nullable reference types, and number 5, null forgiving operators. So let's dig in. Do you want to earn $100,000 a year? Do you want to become a software developer within just 3 months? With our amazing course and awesome tutors, you never have to worry about getting stuck. We help students to learn skills that companies want to hire. We are Startup Hack. Don't forget to subscribe our channel. So let's get started. Alright, let's move towards the first topic, null reference exception. This exception is thrown when you try to access a member of an object that is null, causing your code to crash. So in this example, the variable myString is assigned to a null value, but when we attempt to access its length property without checking if it's null, that results in a null reference exception. Because you cannot access members of an object that is null, to avoid this exception, you would need to check if myString is null before accessing its member like this. This code check if myString is null before accessing its length property, avoiding the null reference exception. Okay, now moving towards null coalescing operator. This operator allows you to provide a default value for a null reference type, making it easier to handle cases where a reference type might be null. Here's an example of using null coalescing operator in C#. In this example, we have a user class with a name property and a age property that is nullable. When we create an instance of a user class, we only set the name property but leave the age property unassigned, so it's null. When we then use the null coalescing operator to provide default values for the name and age properties, if the name property is null, we set it to unknown. If the age property is null, we set it to 0. The result that the value of name is John Doe and the value of age is 0. This allows us to handle null values in a concise and readable way without having to write multiple checks for null values. So the second example is if number is null, the enumerable.empty int method will return an empty collection of integers, so the for each loop will not throw a null reference exception. This approach ensures that the loop will always have a valid collection to iterate over if the original collection is null. Now, null conditional operator. The null conditional operator in C# provide a concise way to access property or method of an object without having to check for null values first. Here's an example of using the null conditional operator. In this example, we have a user class with the name property and an address property. When we create an instance of the user class, we only set the name property but leave the address property unassigned, so it's null. We then use the null conditional operator to access the street property of the address object without having to check for null first. If either user or user.address is null, the result of the expression will be null, and this double question mark operator is used to provide a default value of unknown. Okay, now let us see non-nullable reference type. In C#, 8 non-nullable reference type were introduced which allow you to specify a reference type must not be null when it is used. After you enable this feature, all the reference types are non-nullable by default unless you explicitly specify it is nullable. This helps to prevent null reference exception from occurring in your code. So here's an example of using non-nullable reference type. In this example, we have a user class with the name property and an address property. The name property is declared with a non-nullable reference type and it is initialized with an empty string. The address property is declared with a nullable reference type and it is not initialized, so it's null by default. We then create an instance of the user class and then assign it to variable user. When we access the name property, the compiler does not issue a warning since it's non-nullable reference type and is initialized. However, when we access the address property, we need to use the null forgiving operator to explicitly check that it's not null, or the compiler will issue a warning. This ensures that we are aware of the potential value and prevents unintended behavior. The result is that value of name in an empty string and the value of address is null. This allows us to ensure that reference type variables are not null unless explicitly allowed and reduces the likelihood of null reference exception. Non-nullable reference type feature is enabled after .NET 6. You can disable it at the project level by adding the nullable disable project settings. In single C# source file, you can add the hash nullable disable program to disable the nullable contacts. Now, null forgiving operator. The null forgiving operator in C# is used to suppress the null check when we accessing a null reference type. This operator allows you to access property or call a method of a nullable reference type without checking for null first. So here's an example of using the null forgiving operator. In this example, we have a user class and with a name property and an address property. The address property is declared as a null reference type and is not initialized, so it's null by default. We then create an instance of a user class and assign it to variable user. We access the address property and assign it to the variable address. We then check if address is null, and if it's not, we access the street property of the value property. Finally, we use the null forgiving operator to access the street property of the address property directly without checking for null. If address is null, a system.null reference exception is thrown at a runtime. The null forgiving operator can be useful in certain cases, such as when you know for sure that a reference type is not null, or when you want to throw an exception if it's null. However, it's generally recommended to use null coalescing operator or non-nullable reference type to handle null values, as these approaches are safer, more explicit. These features, along with the REST language and runtime, provide a powerful and flexible toolset for handling null values in C#. By using these features effectively, you can write safer and more reliable code that is less prone to null reference exceptions and other issues related to null values. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned the concept of how to handle null in C#. So don't forget to subscribe our channel and hit the bell icon for latest updates. To joining our course, you can simply go to our website called startuphack.com/start-now. Thank you.